Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Lusting Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. Today's a good one. This is the second time I've been lucky enough to talk to Peter Carlin. We're here to talk a lot of things, but mostly his new book, Tonight in Jungleland, The Making of Born to Run. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about the book. I was lucky enough to get an early copy and I finished it. So I have some questions, all good. But as we're recording this, we just recently lost Brian Wilson. One of the books that I adored you had wrote was Catch a Wave, The Rise and Fall of the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson. Any thoughts you want to share about us losing Brian?
It's terribly sad. It's jarring to lose somebody who's been such a pillar, and especially Brian had such a challenging life in a lot of ways. But to me, the miraculous thing about his story, which I got to cover when I was working on the book, was that whole period of late life redemption and renaissance. Because I really fell in love with Brian's work and to some extent his story when I was like 13 in the mid 70s. And even then I was a child, but people would say, yeah, he's got all these bad habits and he's like overweight and he takes drugs and all this stuff. And so there was so much chaos around his life. You had the sense that he might not be around very long. He was one of those guys who was always on the list of the next rock star who's going to die, except he didn't. And he didn't, and he didn't. And he got through all these calamities. I mean, being his emotional problems or psychiatric problems, and then the bizarre situation with that evil psychologist, Dr. Landy, who kidnapped him for a long time. And he survived all that stuff and came out the other end as an older guy in his 50s and then suddenly just blossomed. And the fact that he managed to go back and confront the specter of Smile, that brilliant psychedelic kind of conceptual album that he started in 1966 that then became a millstone around his neck. It developed its own legend. And in a weird way, the non-existence of the album made it so much more powerful than it could possibly have been, even if it came out when it was intended to come out, because it was so innovative and so beautiful and unexpected in all those different ways. But the fact that shards of it had come out that sort of implied how majestic the thing was, but it was unfinished. It became like the most significant thing about him, and that's in a career where he made all those hit records in the early 60s and into the mid 60s, and then made Good Vibrations and Pet Sounds and made these incredible music that was so hugely innovative and influential on the Beatles and Dylan and everyone that made records. It was like this guy was so extraordinary. And here was this thing that was his masterwork, but he never quite finished it. And this sort of shadow of the non-existent thing overwhelmed his reputation. And he had to live with it. And he didn't like it. He didn't like to talk about it. It freaked him out. But then eventually he got to a place in his life where he was comfortable enough and he agreed that, okay, we can perform this music. And then once they started playing the music, suddenly I talked to Darian Sahanaja, who was like the band leader in his
Yeah.
solo band. And they were sitting around and he was trying to remember the words to a song called Roll Plymouth Rock, which also was alternately called Do You Like Worms? And he's sitting there and he goes, hang on a second. And he just dials his phone. And he goes, Van Dyke, it's Brian. He's like, what's that word in the second verse of, and Van Dyke is, oh, it's Indians, and he's, oh yeah. And Darian was astounded that he just called up Van Dyke, who was his collaborator on that record. And
Yeah.
then the next morning he showed up to do the work with Brian, and Brian standing on the front porch and he goes, oh, Van Dyke's going to be here in about 15 minutes. And then he was on board again, and they just went right back into co-creating this album. And when it came out, it was a triumph.
It
I was
was.
at I was at his memorial service in LA last week, and what was fascinating to me and touching was that so much of the art that they had around there was smile related. And they really, it's a big part of the actual existence of this record that took him nearly 40 years to finish is now his signature piece.
Couple things. One, I remember in the introduction of your book, you talk about Endless Summer, and that's where I discovered Brian and the Beach Boys as well. I think Endless Summer in a lot of ways is Brian and the Beach Boys version of Born in the USA. It's the gateway album to a lot of people like Bruce's. The other thing is I remember that Beautiful Dreamer documentary that David Leaf did, and you could see he was actually afraid, just all closed off. And then when you see that, I was lucky enough to see him multiple times with the Beach Boys and solo, but I remember when he toured with Pet Sounds Live the first time, and I just cried because he seemed to be happy and he
Yeah,
seemed to be enjoying life.
yeah, yeah. There are these charming stories. I first met him in the late 90s, I guess, in
Yeah.
1998, I think it was. And I was talking to him, and I can't remember what the question was or what we were talking about, but he said something about, he goes, he said something about like his problems or whatever. And I go, what is your problem? And he goes, it's just that I'm so scared of the world and everybody in it. And then he looked and he just shrugged and he goes, what a mess. And but then he laughed. He had this incredible self-awareness that would shine through from time to time, and a really cool sense of humor about who he was and what his deal was, because it was so complicated. But
Yeah.
he was I adored him.
Yeah.
He wasn't always easy to interview with. He wasn't always easy to hang around with because sometimes he just wasn't comfortable.
Right.
His thing, his psychiatric situation was changed from day to day. And if there was stress in his life, he could really shut down. But then he could be when he was relaxed and comfortable, he was just delightful. And I'm thrilled that I got a chance to get to know him and hang out with him and have these occasionally just loopy and thrilling conversations with him.
Good. We're going to move to Bruce, but I had one other story. A couple of years ago, David Leaf was nice enough to join me on the podcast, and we did two episodes. We did an episode him talking as a Bruce fan, and then we did a second
Mm,
episode as Brian, right? And I was telling him that the last time I saw Brian, it it was uncomfortable because Brian was with a walker. It didn't feel like he could sing as much. And I
mm-hmm,
said, and it concerned me
mm-hmm,
because he had been manipulated so much in his life. And David says Brian tours for three reasons. He said the first reason is he loves the band behind him playing
mm-hmm,
his music magically. And
mm-hmm,
that band is just amazing, which I agree with. Secondly, he loves the love he gets from the audience. The
mm-hmm,
feeling of how much his music means to people and all that, pardon the pun, vibrations coming to him. And then
mm-hmm.
third, he loves room service.
Yeah, there's that too.
And
Yeah, exactly.
and
Yeah.
I said that's a good as reason to tour as any. You
Did you
know?
see this? Did you see the Smile tour in 2005?
I did not see that. I saw the peer pressure tour and I've done a couple others, but I did not get to see Smile. I would have loved that.
Yeah, because I remember the first time I saw Brian was in Play with the Beach Boys was in 1976, the
Yeah.
Brian is Back tour, and he
Yes.
was and the times I saw him perform with the Beach Boys, which was a handful of times in the late 70s and into the early 80s, he was
Yeah.
like, you had the sense that he was this trained bear who
Exactly.
was
That was
captive,
exactly the words I was going to use.
But by the time he was playing with the solo band, his own band, he was relaxing. And that Smile tour, it was amazing how I couldn't believe how good he was,
Yeah.
because he sang lead on all those songs, and they're complicated songs. And I've one really Brian fan Fantasia story, but
Okay, please.
in Portland, I was living in Portland at the time, and my son, my middle son, wanted to come see the show when they came to play. And I was really tight with them because I was working on the book at the time, so I was knew them all real well. And so when they came to town, they gave me really great seats and a bunch of backstage passes. Brian played the first half of the show, and then there was a break. And so I turned to my son, who was then 7, and I said, "You want to look backstage?" And he was like, "Yeah." So we went backstage and we got to the band room where everybody was. And we go in there, and the first thing that happens is that Darian and Probin Gregory, who I'd gotten to know really well, they see me with my little kid, and they come sprinting up, and they're grabbing cookies and brownies, and they're stuffing them in Teddy's pockets, and say, "What else do you want? What else?" And he's thrilled. But then I heard Brian's wife, Melinda, say, "Brian, go say hi to Peter's son." So Brian came up, and he was so good with kids. He kneeled down in front of Teddy. You know, he was a big guy. He was like
Yeah.
6'2". And he knelt down and he said, "Hey, I'm Brian." And I shook his hand and he goes, "So what do you think so far?" And Teddy didn't know, my son Teddy didn't know what to say. He goes, "It's pretty good." And Brian goes, "Pretty good." And then he nods and he goes, "Yeah, well, just wait till you see Smile. It'll knock your socks off." And Teddy was like, "Okay." And then we went and saw the rest of the show, and it was
Yeah.
amazing. But just that he was so, for me, who had spent so much of my life mourning the loss and the absence of that album, and to think of it in these terms of this thing that was too beautiful to exist in the world. So of course we can't have it because we can't have nice things. And then 40 years later to have it go, well, on second thought, why don't I just finish it and put it out and then tour all around the world playing this record over and over? It was like spectacular. And that he was after all those years of like him not wanting to talk about it, feeling so burdened by its legend, to have him say with a big smile on his face, "It'll knock your socks off." It was like, yes, it was a lovely moment.
Yeah. So much for that there are no second acts in American lives
Yeah.
because, yeah, what a wonderful tribute. All right, so we're going to switch over to Bruce. Did you get to see any of the shows this tour?
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, I saw 4 shows or something. I think I saw them in Seattle and then down in San Francisco and then Asbury Park. I saw that the See Here Now show,
Oh, wow.
and then a couple months later, I guess, a few months later, the up in Vancouver.
Well, you talk about your visiting with Bruce after the See Now. I wasn't there, but I've had multiple people that are return guests on the podcast say that because of the circumstances, because of the song selection, because of the atmosphere and location, it may be the greatest show they've ever seen. I know
Yeah.
that's the way, as you say, that when a team wins the Super Bowl, they're the greatest team ever. But thoughts on that? How do you rank it in all the shows you've seen?
I've seen some pretty cool shows over the years. I've been super lucky and had a chance to see him as far back as 1978 on the Darkness tour. And so I've seen some that was amazing. And I when I saw the Broadway show and I saw him play at the Light of Day thing in the Paramount Theater in Asbury, which was really cool. And so I've had that was a great show. And I saw a bunch of the other shows on that tour in 2023 and 2024, and those were great shows too. But being on the beach in Asbury with him, they opened up with Lonesome Day, which is it's one that's a good opening song, and then immediately went right into Blinded by the Light, and it was like, oh, this is going to be a different kind of show.
Yeah.
And I know because I talked to him about it, it was like super powerful for him to be back on the beach in Asbury and being able to see the boardwalk and the casino and all that stuff there, which have been like the central landmarks of his adult life and loom so large in his vision and his mythology. To be there and to be able to perform to 40,000 people on the beach in the place where he spent a long time wondering if he was ever even going to make it. And also, I think it was important for him to see, to realize again how much Asbury has blossomed in the last 10 years,
Yeah.
because it's so much livelier than it was even in the mid-teens. And I think he feels, I don't know if he, I think he understands that his influence had something to do with that. But I think also he's just thrilled. He knows that he thanked, one of the things that was interesting was that he did a shout out to the gay community for all the work
Yeah.
that they put into reviving downtown, because there were so many important businesses and restaurants and stuff that came out of members of the gay and lesbian community, and that was cool. So he really,
Yeah.
and I think that he really loves what's happened to that town.
One of the things I thought of when I was reading about that in the book is years ago in the early 80s, my wife now, but at the time girlfriend, went to a John Denver concert. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things John Denver said is this, what's a packed, auditorium. He said there were times when I would be play my guitar and it literally ache to be able to play for someone. And
Yeah.
to now see this crowd, you can't know how happy it makes me. And I thought,
Mm-hmm.
I said, that I'm sure Bruce is like, wow, kid, you've
Mm-hmm.
come a long way.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that he's so connected still to just to the idea of converting a fan. In when he came to play in Seattle in 2023, I took my girlfriend who had never seen him perform before, and I'd seen him a bunch of times, and she had not been a fan by
Right.
any stretch. Up and it was an awkward thing because I wrote that biography, and
Yeah.
obviously Bruce is a super significant artist to me, and someone I actually know, which is magical unto itself. And
Sure.
so but it took her a long time to finally read my book, the biography, of all my books.
Yeah.
She'd read them all, but she kind of drug her feet on that. But then she did, and then she started listening, and she fell in love with Greetings. That's her favorite Bruce record. And then I took her to the show.
Yeah.
And she was like, we got 4 songs in, and she grabbed my arm. She goes, I'm fucking loving this. And I told, after the show was over, this was still, they had a pretty tight COVID protocol, so I
Yeah.
didn't get to go say hi to Bruce backstage, but I texted him after the show, and I said, hey, that was really cool, and I just want you to know that it was the first time my girlfriend saw you play, and she was just utterly blown away. And he wrote back, wait, what? Really? He goes, I love the conversion stories. And it was like there had been like 20,000 people screaming and carrying on like they do at
Yeah.
Bruce shows. But what seemed to really resonate with him that night was the fact that Claire saw him for the first time and was utterly won over. And so she was driving us home, and I was texting with him, and he was like saying, tell her I love her too. It was this very flirtatious thing, and I was like, and she's anyway. But what was interesting to me was the extent to which, like, what seemed to resonate with him that night wasn't the vast faceless crowd
Yeah.
raining down their cheers, but the one girl who had never seen
Yeah.
him before, who was utterly transformed by the experience. Like, that's the thing.
I do want to ask you, and then we're going to get to the book. Any thoughts on him standing up with thoughts about this administration? It seems very
Not
on brand.
very on brand. I was delighted that he did that because a lot of people aren't.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think he understands the power of his voice. And I think he also understands that if you don't do it now, when will you do it?
Yeah.
What is it and I think his willingness to do that and to be so clear about how he feels about what's going on is really, I think it's significant, and I know how important it is to him. And once again, it's one of those things that makes you feel proud of him and his courage, which he's displayed in a lot of different ways, at a
Yeah.
lot of different times. And he speaks up for the good American. He's grew up without a lot of money, and he knows what it's like to be poor and to feel outcast.
Yeah.
And I think he's always felt most involved with the underdog,
Yeah.
and does not like when the rich and the powerful just ride rampant
Yep.
over everybody else.
Yeah, I have my Rise Up shirt on today
Yeah, I
as we're
noticed.
talking. Yeah. All right. So we're talking to Peter Carlin tonight in Jungleland, the making of Born to Run. Tell me the origin story of the book. Why did you decide to write it besides the anniversary date?
I was trying to figure. It was a spring of, I guess, early spring of last year, and in March or whatever of 2024. And I was like, I had finished my REM book, which hadn't quite come out yet, so it was time to come up with something new. And I was digging around trying to figure out what do I want to do. And I thought about a bunch of different things and did a bunch of work on some things that didn't quite come together in my imagination. And then I began to think maybe I got something in my Springsteen archives that I can fiddle around with and everything. And then suddenly I realized it's going to be 50 years that Born to Run, that anniversary is coming up. So maybe that would be a good reason to dig into this. And so I talked to my agent and then my editor at Doubleday, and they're like, yeah, great. You should do that. That would be cool. Given the rhythms of publishing, it's like you need to have the whole thing done in 6 months. And
Yeah.
I was like, okay. And the my aforementioned girlfriend partner was like, oh yeah, you have to do that, and I will support every moment of it. She's a writer too, so she gets it. And so I just dove in. And originally, I thought I probably have stuff in my archive, like interviews, and I must have tons of stuff about Born to Run, so I'll have a head start. And but then once I got going and Bruce and John were like into the project and wanted to talk and be a part of it, which was terrific. But then I started digging into my files and I began to realize I don't have a lot of leftover Born to Run stuff. And it was like, ah, shit, I gotta go. So it was like,
Yeah.
and then I just was like, that's it then. That's the end of my social life. And so all I did was I did a lot of traveling and visited archives and did interviews with people in LA and then in New York and New Jersey and made a bunch of trips around the country. And then it just became, it was like I began to realize that even though I had spent all that time covering Bruce's life and career for the biography, that I hadn't really, because the terrain was so vast from his birth, before his birth, really, to the then present moment when he was in his early 60s. It was like, I gotta figure out, I didn't have, I obviously I traced the Born to Run story and described where he was in that moment in his career, but there was a lot of questions I didn't get a chance to ask. And a lot of times, so it became this. So once I began to dig in and talk to people, I began to realize like the depth of what there was there and how much, what a fascinating period it was. And one of the things I thought that really steered me, what really intrigued me was this was that moment when you didn't know whether he was going to make it or not. Even I really fell into, I remember when Born to Run came out and I was like 12 at the time. And so I heard it on the radio and it was very different from what I was used to. But I was a kid and I didn't quite manage to find my way to it in a serious way. And then I began to hear more of his early stuff I remember hearing Spirit in the Night on the radio. And then when Manfred Mann had that big hit with Blinded by the Light, their interpretation of it, but it took me a while. But then when Darkness came out, I was in high school, and that was the one that was my point of entry. And I saw him play on that tour, and that was just like the transformative experience for me. But there was still on the West Coast where I grew up, even in 1978, like it was super easy to get tickets to the show. It's
Yeah.
like they were, and I bought them like a week before the show began, and there were still plenty of seats available. And he didn't get played on the radio a lot, and so you had a sense of fighting the good fight to try to get your friends interested in Bruce. You got to check it out, man. It's so cool. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't know. I don't like his voice. You'll get used to it. You
Yeah.
just got to listen to the song. And then when The River came out, I was a senior in high school. And I had friends who came up to me and they were like, you were right about Springsteen. And I was like, yeah, but
What?
I was always trying to
Yeah.
drag people to shows, but it was the thing before the river. He was not on the radio
Oh,
and not a mainstream guy.
Yeah.
And there were certain places where he could play arenas and stuff, but by and large, he'd come out west and it was theaters
Yes.
until the River Tour. And then they had the hit
Yeah.
single with Hungry Heart, and it was huge. But going back even 5 years before that, they were going to drop him from Columbia.
Yeah.
He was going around and they'd go to towns and play in a nightclub, and nobody would show up because he wasn't on the radio and nobody knew who he was. And then he would play those extraordinary shows, and then the buzz would start.
Yeah.
But the first few visits to town, there would, as often as not, there wouldn't be anybody there.
You
And the
know,
guys at
yeah.
Columbia wanted to drop him. Charlie Koppelman was like, put him on the drop list.
Yeah.
And it was really by the skin of his teeth and the grace of having those apostles beavering away in the company, Peter
Yeah.
Philbin and Paul Rappaport, and those guys who were there saying, no, you gotta, this is the guy. We gotta invest in this. He's the one.
A couple things. One, I was going to ask you, and I think you addressed it, but if anything extra, I was wondering the feelings of going from a whole time period to just putting a microscope on one
Mm-hmm.
thing. Did that use different muscles? Was it a fun experience for you?
It was super fun. It was incredibly fun. I got to go, I had a chance to see a lot of the Barry Rebo footage that he shot in the 70s. He was Bruce's friend on the Jersey Shore, Bruce was the kid with the guitar and Barry was the kid with a camera. And
Yeah.
starting in 1971, he was talking to Bruce about, I'd like to make a documentary about you trying to be a rock star. Bruce was like, okay. So then he shot all these shows, which I don't know if you've seen bits of them in Tom
Yeah.
Zinni's film, but 1973 at that college in Long Island is a whole show. And he shot like a bunch of the stuff in 75 and the Schaefer Beer Show in 1974, or at least parts of it. So being able to watch all that stuff over again, I'm just like I'm agog.
Yeah.
And the other thing I got to do this time was to go into the studio at Battery Studios, which is the site of the former record plant. So it was
Yeah.
where they made the album, and listen to everything they had in the archive. So all of the takes that got preserved. And when I sat around, and you think, how fun is it to listen to the same song getting played over and over again? But if it's Backstreets, it's a lot of fun. Well, at
Yeah.
least for me.
Exactly.
And to hear the chatter between the takes, and then when they would start to play covers just for fun, just to knock the dust off or whatever. And there's this amazing cover of Louie Louie and an amazing cover of Rumble, the Link Ray song,
Yeah.
and Needles and Pins, and the band is so sharp, and they're having a ball. And then there's periods where they're not having a ball, where it's a struggle because Bruce doesn't quite know what he wants or doesn't quite know how to get it. And he's driving everyone crazy, including himself.
What I think it'd be funny is when going back to the Beach Boys, when they did the fake Beach Boy party, would
Right.
be cool to do a E Street party and pull some of those. What When I read Delivery from Nowhere, I said, this is a mystery story. This is a
Mm-hmm.
story of why did he have to make that album? What I found as I was listening to this is it feels like when they tell the myth of Bruce
Mm-hmm.
Springsteen, they go, first two albums weren't successful. Born to Run, and he became Bruce Springsteen. And the book explains it was not that easy. The
Yeah.
recording was not that easy. And historically, right, it's famous. He didn't like the finish. But even when it was turned in, he worked his ass off. And you cover that in the book about how to promote it and how to
Mm-hmm.
get ears listening to it. Do you want to talk a little about that?
A large part of the process was figuring out, like, really coming to terms with who he wanted to be as an artist, and
Yeah.
what his voice was going to be, and what his sound was going to be, and what was his image going to be. And you can't overstate the importance of the cover photo and who he is in that photo, because it's a very different version of himself than the guy on the back of Greetings or the guy on the cover of Wild and the Innocent. On the first album, he's got his Dylan-esque work shirt and he's standing there bearded and curly haired, and then on the cover of Wild and the Innocent, he's like this, he's sitting there and he's very thoughtful and he's got this poetic look on his face, and in the back he's with the whole band and they're on the beach
Yeah.
and they're all sandy looking and everything. So he's like the boardwalk rat. And that's all honest. That's exactly who he is. But then he's also the guy on the cover of Born to Run because he loves Elvis, right? He loves that old stuff. And the project on this album, in some ways, was to take the sort of visceral crunch of early Elvis and Chuck Berry and the early rock and roll, the great old rock and roll stuff, and repair the flag and raise the standard into the mid 70s and be able to come up with this cold fusion of the visceral power of Elvis and the excitement of Elvis and the intellect and the poetry of Bob Dylan, and figure out a way to spin those things together. But when he's on, because what he understands is what Dylan also understood, which is that those early rockers from the 50s were hugely important to Dylan.
Yes.
And he was trying to, and his draw to rock and roll and wanting to go electric and play that type of music was that he understood that that you could do a lot with that powerful physicality of rock and roll.
Yeah.
And spin it together with the intellectual heft that he had and his interest in beat poetry and all that stuff. And so Springsteen 10 years later was like doing his own version of that same thing in that kind of post-Watergate cynical mid 70s. He was like, screw cynicism. You got to believe in something.
Yeah.
And one thing I believe in, as you see on the cover, is Elvis Presley, who in 1975 was as unhip as he could possibly be. He's totally fucked up. It's the peanut butter and the deep fried peanut butter and banana sandwich Elvis with karate kicks and the whole business. But it's like some inside there's still beats the heart of that rebel.
Yeah.
And that's who Bruce wanted to be.
Yeah, that's obviously an iconic cover. And a friend of mine was doing a sketchbook. He did 100 sketches for 100 people. And so he writes for My Little Pony, and he's done My Little Pony. So I asked him, I said, I want Bruce Springsteen and Big Band and they existed in My Little Pony world.
Yeah, there they are.
Yeah, there they are.
But there's like that Sesame Street record that has a cover of Bert and Ernie, and they're in the same pose.
Exactly.
And then the power of that image, it's so hugely iconic. Remember when they played the Super Bowl in January of 2009 or February, whenever that was. And when they began that
silhouette,
there's that silhouette of him and Clarence standing back to back, and Clarence has a saxophone and Bruce is waving his holding up that Telecaster. Yeah. And that's how powerful that image is.
I don't want to spoil too many stories from the book, but would like you to. I thought the story from Pam and you discussing the 10,000 hours was really interesting. Do you mind sharing that?
Sure. Absolutely. I was talking to Pam Springsteen, Bruce's sister, in LA. When I was working on the biography, and we were talking about Bruce's work ethic and the amount of time he spent practicing his guitar in his room, working on his moves in the mirror, the amount of time he spent rehearsing, the amount of time, just how incredibly hard he worked. And I said, and at the time, I can't remember what book it was that Gladwell wrote, Malcolm Gladwell, the Outliers or whatever it is. And he posits this 10,000 hour theory, which is basically if you spend 10,000 hours working on anything, you'll basically be a genius at it. You'll be fantastic at it. And he talks about one of his examples was like the Beatles played all those shows, spent all those hours on stage in the Cavern and then in Hamburg at the Top 10 Club and the Star Club and all these different places, and it's so obviously, right? Like you, and so he tried to do this sort of reductive thing of saying it's about the time. It's and so in a way, does that mean you could just take four random guys and shove instruments in their hands and say, "Be gone, come back after 10,000 hours," and when they come back, they'll be the Beatles or some
Yeah.
equivalent? It's and I just thought, like, my initial reaction to that was, "What a bunch of bullshit." But then I was talking to Pam, and she was talking about her memories of being young and knowing that her brother could always be found in his room playing the guitar and how hard he rehearsed and all. And I said, well, it's like Malcolm Gladwell in the 10,000 hours. And she goes, no, absolutely not. And I was like, oh, thank God. It was like,
Yeah.
tell me more. And she said, and this is the key thing she said, she goes, it's not the 10,000 hours. It's why you need to spend 10,000 hours working on something that makes the difference. It's the obsession and what fuels the obsession. And Bruce is very articulate about A, what his obsession is, and B, what fuels his obsession, what that hole is inside him that he's trying to fill with music and with his songwriting and his performances. It's like somebody who drains himself and works as hard as he does on stage. I remember seeing him in the late 70s and then on the River tour. And I have a very vivid memory of getting into the encores of the River show in Seattle in October of 1980. And he's just playing, it's just going on, and he's hanging off the microphone stand doing his whole, I'm a prisoner of rock and roll. And I remember thinking, like, I'm worried he's going to hurt himself up there. Like,
Yeah.
I am just standing here or sitting or whatever it was watching the show, and I've been here for 3 hours and I'm exhausted, and I'm not the guy doing all that stuff up there. And it was interesting to me that when I was working on the biography, that John Landau said, that was a time when I finally pulled him aside and said, you got to leave a little more in the tank. Like, you can't
Yeah.
push yourself over the edge every single time. But Bruce, I asked him about that, and he goes, I just didn't have anywhere else to go, and I didn't want to go home. And that's where he feels like he's the most heroic, greatest version of himself.
Yeah.
So therein lay that. But I thought Pam's answer to that question and her ability to see right through it and say it's the obsession.
Yeah.
It's the it's the emptiness inside that you're trying to fill. That's what matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a cool moment.
Yeah, I did. I thought that was great. Anything that surprised you in the research?
What surprised me was I think it was how traumatized the people who worked with Bruce were
Yeah.
as a result of his crazy obsession with making Born to Run, and the fact that it was such an existential experience for him, because he really felt that if he didn't get this right, he was going to be finished, and this was his last chance. And so that's why I was talking to Stephen Appel, who is Mike's little brother, who was like a road manager, assistant to Bruce. And when they were in the studio, he would be there helping with the equipment and helping to ease Bruce through the sessions. And he said, we love him. We love these songs. We love this music. Everybody is there to help him make this record. Come on, Bruce, let's do this. This is fantastic. But then he does this thing where he would spend 6 hours playing the same two notes, and he would do things to make you crazy. And he goes, he's acting like a psychopath. But after 14 hours in the studio, you're the psychopath, because he's saying, this sucks. I hate this. We have to do this differently. And you're like, okay, how can we help? And then you do this thing and you completely change the sound of something. You make it, you do what he wants you to do. You get it exactly where he wants it to go. And then he listens to it and he goes, now this sucks. I think the first version was better. And they're like, and that just went on week after week. And he said, yeah, that was my way in those days. He goes, I just needed to push everyone to the line. All that came to a climax at that showdown in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, where the album's done. he's made exactly the album he set out to make in exactly the way he set out to make it, with the musicians he wanted to work with, the producers he wanted to work with, in the studio he wanted to work in. And they bring it in, it's all done, he listens to it and he thinks, this sucks. And they're like, what? Jimmy Iovine was like, he came with a friend. He goes, unfortunately, the friend had some Xanax or whatever,
Yeah.
Valium is what he had. And he's just, because he's thinking, I did something really wrong and now this
Yeah.
is sunk. And Bruce is saying, let's just throw this away and start over again. But basically, when I asked Bruce about that, he goes, it just made me feel itchy on the inside and the
Yeah.
outside. And I felt like what he was experiencing, I think, Bruce is always divided between his sense that he's the golden boy and touched by greatness, and this sense that he's an absolute loser who is touched by the gutter and will always be scuffling around. And a lot of that goes back to his primal experiences with the grandparents who adored him and the father who was concerned for him and
Yeah.
tried to keep him focused and strong, but spoke in a way that made Bruce feel that his dad was contemptuous of him, because Doug had emotional psychiatric
Yeah.
problems and it was difficult for him and he was uncomfortable in his own skin. But Bruce's experience of that was contempt. And so when I think it was terrifying for him to realize that this piece of work it was not mediated through anyone else's vision. There were no limits. It was all him, basically, with the help of his
Yeah.
bandmates and friends.
So,
And the thought that he could have done exactly what he wanted to do and it still wouldn't be good enough was terrifying. And so he
yeah.
did not want to rest with that record.
He says a lot of that over the years about, to be a great musician, someone says you're the God's gift, and another says you're the worst thing ever. So that's
Right.
true. And yeah, I can think that's scary. There's that great Simpson episode where Bart fails the test and the teacher goes, "Why are you crying?" Because I've never tried before and now I've failed. And so I can imagine that if this doesn't work, what do I hide behind?
Yeah,
So yeah,
exactly.
that's got to be scary. Anything you didn't get in the book that you just didn't work for you? Because often you hear, like on scripture stories, like, I really love this joke, but had to take it out to make the story. Anything that you didn't get to put in that you just, it was interesting, but it didn't work with the story you're wanting to tell?
Yeah, there was a really interesting thing about how after Born to Run came out, there was all this interest from Hollywood. People wanted him to they saw him as a leading man. And he had a meeting with, there was Christ, it was Jesus, who direct, it's slipped off my tongue, but remember the movie Ragtime? Was it Milo? It was Milos
Yeah.
Forman. I
Okay.
think it was Milos Forman, and there was a meeting that they set up in London, and Foreman was about to make, I think he was going to make Ragtime, and he wanted Bruce to be in it. And they had a meeting, and Bruce was into it, but then, everything blew up with Mike Appel,
Yeah.
and I think also he was concerned that since he had his hard won success in music, he didn't want to have his next step be doing a shitty performance in a movie in
And
case it didn't work out.
I think Elvis is a
Yeah,
cautionary tale, right?
yeah,
So what's next for you, Peter, besides promoting the book? And
yeah.
I
Well, there's
hope you're
that.
enjoying the box set. We didn't even get
Oh,
to
of
talk about
course.
that.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I got to promote this thing. I'm about to get married, so that's nice.
oh,
And
not.
yeah, and then I don't know. I've got some thoughts and ideas, and I've been doing some reading, but it's way too early to really talk about
I'm saying prequel to Little Larry from Nowhere.
it.
Let's just keep the crew together. So, how about any in-person events, signings coming up?
Oh
Anything you
yeah,
want to promote?
Sure. There's going to be, as it stands, there's going to be an array. There's going to be a bunch of different events around the country for this, doing some stuff right around the time of publication in Seattle and Portland and LA. At Seattle's at Third Place Books in Seward Park on the 5th, and then down to Portland for the 6th at Powell's downtown.
Okay.
And then on the 11th at Book Soup in LA, Monday the
Okay.
11th. And then in early September, there's a bunch of events that I think there's like a week's worth of events around New Jersey that are built around the symposium on the 6th.
Okay.
And I'll be moderating a panel with Bruce and John, and I think David Sanchez and Boom Carter. And I think I'm on a different panel, and I can't remember what that one's about. But so that's happening, and then there's an event I think at Asbury Park on the 7th, and a
Okay.
few other things around New Jersey that week.
That's
And
awesome.
hopefully we'll put together something for New York City as well, but I'm not sure that's been wired down yet.
Yeah.
And that's all early September.
I am looking forward to hopefully getting to meet you at
Yeah.
the symposium. I will do a little fanboy and probably bring a couple of books for you to sign, even though it's
Fabulous.
not cool. So, any final thoughts before I get you out of here?
It was delightful to do this again and to spend this time with Bruce and his folks. They're really, one of the neat things about it is that they're just really nice, smart, interesting people and funny as hell by and large. And everybody has interesting stories to tell. And so it's been a real pleasure to dive back into Bruce world and get this time with him and John and Mike Appel and everybody else. So that's just been it was a fun project, and I'm really happy with the book. I'm really proud of how it came out.
Yeah, Tonight in Jungleland, The Making of Born to Run, Peter Ames Carlin. It is available August 5th, I believe.
That's right.
Correct? So I'm
Yep.
going to time this so it'll be all out on August 5th. Thank you.
Splendid.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. I always love visiting with you. You're always a great interview. You're just a wonderful person. And any quick thoughts, any favorite albums on the box set that speaks out to you?
Oh, I like the one that's I forget what it's called. The one that's the soundtrack to the spiritual
Fateless.
western
I
with
do
the
too. I want to see that
yeah.
movie. I
Yeah, right.
really
That's a
want to.
really cool. And some of the instrumental pieces
Yeah.
are like I just think those are really super cool.
Yeah, I'll email
Uh
you. I asked AI, please give me a summary of the movie that da da da, and it gave me a summary. So I'll email you that. So
I'm not a huge AI fan, but
yeah,
sometimes it coughs
yeah.
up something that's
And
interesting.
there's a couple of people have theorized that there is a Scorsese film he was doing on a book, and that might be it. I don't know, but I loved them all. But I do
Yeah,
agree that was pretty cool. And the crooner was I love seeing that side of Bruce.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. No, I'm a huge fan of Western Stars. I mean,
me
I
too.
absolutely adore that. It feels like the sequel to Darkness on the Edge of Town to me,
Yeah,
about
I
those
could see that.
characters and the world, the sort of desert, southwestern desert that they seem to be moving around in. But it felt to me a lot like those same characters, but instead of looking ahead to adulthood, they're looking back
Yeah,
and dealing with the loss and regrets and the toll of decisions that they've made. And
absolutely.
I love that record. I adore that record. So this other stuff is cool to get a
Yeah,
chance to hear as well.
absolutely. All right. Once again, Tonight in Jungleland, The Making of Born to Run, available everywhere August 5th. Check it out. You will love this book. Even if you're not a Bruce fan, you will love this book. It is a fascinating story of how, to use the sports metaphor, right? Like just one last chance to make it real, to quote.
Yeah,
And so I appreciate it. Peter, let's do this again sometimes.
absolutely.
Hopefully, lots of success. Be safe, travel kind, and we'll see you in September.
Excellent. See you then, man.
All right.
Thanks
Bye,
again.
everyone.
Bye bye.